Because if you were to look at the next slide, you would probably guess that this is what we call adipose tissue. Well, what is adipose tissue anyway, but fat? So we're actually looking at fat. This is what fat looks like under the microscope. And when you have a spot on your body that contains adipose tissue or fat tissue, these large vacuoles in the tissue form. And this is basically, excuse me, where the fat stores most of its stuff that then can be used as insulation or energy. So you have a lot of open space here that can get filled with material as the body needs to store things. So the next note that you're going to write is a capital F, adipose. Adipose is considered a connective tissue. It's the only connective tissue that does not have a true matrix. So it doesn't have a non-living matrix. It contains these large cells with these huge vacuoles, big spaces. And the actual cell, I'm going to go back to the image for just a moment. The actual cells are right here, and they have these enormous spaces which they use for storage. Here's the cells, here's the cells, here's the cell, and then here's these large vacuoles. And so you can imagine that this type of tissue can get bigger and it can get smaller. And that's why if any of you out here have tried to lose weight before, what you're actually doing is losing the space within those vacuoles. You're actually getting rid of some of the extra material in the vacuoles as you burn the energy. If you need to store extra energy in your body for, let's say if you're going to go out into the wild and you're not going to eat for a couple days, our body can store away energy in fatty acids, we call them, fat molecules. And they get stored in the adipose tissue, in those large vacuoles that you saw. Once the body creates that fat vacuole cell, the fat storage cell, the adipose tissue, it then can start packing away fatty acids, fat molecules as we need them to store. Now, the function of adipose tissue is to store energy or food for the body. It's also really good at padding objects. So we find adipose tissue surrounding most organs. It's all around organs. We have adipose tissue around our heart. We have adipose tissue around our stomach. We have adipose tissue around our liver. We have adipose tissue around our small intestine. We have adipose tissue. Every organ of our body has a certain amount of adipose tissue, sometimes inside of it and covering it. And it's used for energy storage because those organs themselves need a quick spot to grab energy from when they need it. Also for padding. You don't want to damage your liver by getting hit too hard in the side. So your body's created an adipose cushion around that organ and a lot of other organs in your body so that you can take a little bit of a hit without really damaging the organ. Now, if it's hard enough, yes, you can still damage those organs, but it creates a nice, safe environment for our organs. So Yari says, so the cells are the white dots. So that's a really good question. Let me go back. So the cells, the cell membranes are those white dots. There's like a nucleus in each one of those areas. It could be in the corner there, could be in the corner there, could be in the corner. So the entire cell is that big white dot, yes. Does that make sense? This is an adipose cell. This is an adipose cell. This is an adipose cell. Has these huge empty spaces inside of them. Good. Then Mr. Eric says, it's safe to say that if you have two people left out in the wild with nothing to eat, and two people, one is obese, the other is slender, would the obese person live longer? Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, depending on the health of that person, I would say yes, the obese person would probably last longer because they would have a lot more storage to live off of for a longer period of time. It's a good question. Oops, sorry guys. And so I want you to remember, not only is adipose tissue used to store energy, food, it's also a very important molecule for insulating us in addition to padding us. So we need to stay warm in cold climates. And adipose tissue surrounds all of our muscles, creating almost like a shell of insulation to try to keep us warm. Think of a polar bear. Polar bear, underneath that thick fur, they also have the addition of thick fur. Underneath that thick fur, they have a thick layer of adipose tissue, really thick. And they're able to withstand really cold climates without any type of clothing. The fur does a lot, but that adipose tissue underneath is what's really keeping most of that heat in. Now, if they starve, which can become a problem, especially with climate change, they lose a lot of that adipose tissue and then they get cold. And then it stresses the polar bears out. And that's one of the reasons why we're losing them, because they're going hungry and they're losing their insulation, which is supposed to be to keep them warm from their adipose tissue. So adipose tissue is really important. Sometimes, we store more adipose tissue than is probably healthy. And that's partly due to the fact that we have a lot of calories in our diet, which we're going to have a whole section on nutrition, so I don't want to get into it too much. But everything in balance, that's the key to the body staying healthy. We want to keep the body closest to equilibrium as possible. But when somebody does store a lot of extra energy, it's stored in the adipose tissue. So it has three really important functions. There's only really one type of adipose tissue too, and that's, in terms of this class, we're only going to be learning about them as that single type. You can break adipose tissue down into white adipose and brown adipose, but I'm not going to get into the differences at this point, or even, I think we talk about it a little bit later, if I remember correctly. Okay, so we've talked about epithelial tissue. We've talked about connective tissue. Now we have to talk about nervous tissue and then muscle tissue. Abigail, yes. Any thoughts? What are we looking at? What type of a cell are we looking at? It's actually surrounded by other cells, so it's technically tissue, but what type of tissue is this? It's a very particular looking type of tissue. Fernando, Quirino, Yare, and yes, all say neuron or nerve. Jose Manzo says connective tissue. So it has the long strands that connective tissue has. So that's actually a really good guess. But if we were to look really, really close, we would see that only probably this little strand and this little strand are truly connected to this cell here. And this is actually just really close to that cell body. This synapse here is really close to that cell body. This synapse here is really close to that cell body, and so on and so forth. So this is definitely a nerve cell, a neuron. It's actually, what did you just do? It's actually what we call a giant multipolar neuron. Now, this is a diagram of this, and we're actually only looking at the very head of this cell. This is the part that's under the microscope magnification. This is probably the major axon, but it can have multiple axons coming off. We call them giant multipolar neurons because they're, in some instances, huge. We have some neurons that run from our spine all the way to the bottom of our feet. That's a really long cell. Think about how small cells are. Under the microscope, this part of the cell could run for a couple feet before it ends, and that's one single cell. We have cells that run from our brain that go through our spinal cord, and it's one long cell that goes all the way down. That's why when you have a back injury, it can be so dangerous if something breaks in your spine, because if any one of those cells get damaged, not only can they not repair themselves, but that information now no longer has any way to get from your body to your brain or from your brain to your body for movement. So it can be a very catastrophic type of injury. They're called multipolar because you have two sides to them that are a little bit different. And an electrical charge travels from one end down to the next. And that's the purpose of a neuron or a nerve cell. So number 3, with the Roman numerals, neural tissue, in parentheses, nervous. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're good. Letter A, made of neurons. So neural tissue is made of neurons, which we also call nerve cells. Their function is to send messages, to receive messages, to communicate. We find neural tissue in the brain, in the spinal cord, and then also as nerves throughout the body. And so you just have to write the word nerves. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those type of nerves are called. We refer to them as peripheral nerves. And because we're talking about tissue, we're not just talking about a single cell. We're talking about different types of cells that are found in the same location that have similar function. So there are other types of nervous cells that are found around our nerves. And they support them, they nourish them, they provide, they almost are like, they protect them. They create a barrier in the brain in particular. So we're not just talking about that giant multipolar neuron that I was discussing earlier. That's a major part of the nervous system. There are other types of nerve cells that are also found around nerves, in the spinal cord, in the brain, and then throughout the body around nerves. Now, the last type of tissue we're going to talk about is this. And it comes in 3 different types in the body: skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and then cardiac muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle. These are the muscles that you see on someone's body If they're like a bodybuilder and they're just all, you know, they got these big muscles, big biceps, triceps, quadriceps, the glutes, you know, these muscles that when you think of muscles, that's what you're thinking of. These are what we call the skeletal muscles. They're muscles that are attached to our skeleton, and they allow for movement. They allow for movement. Then we have smooth muscle, which has a little different appearance to it, but it does pretty much the same thing. We find these in hollow organs, like the stomach, the small intestines, blood vessels, anything that needs to be able to create a wave-like motion, like our digestive tract, or anything that needs to be able to shrink to size or open up to either restrict blood flow or to allow more blood flow to an area. And they basically, while skeletal muscles have the ability to flatten themselves, we call it contract, and then extend, smooth muscles do more of like a round squeezing motion and then a relaxation, or like a wave-like motion. Skeletal muscles can't function that way. But then there's a third type of muscle, and this is a really special type of muscle because it's only found in the wall of the heart. And we call this cardiac muscle. And you can kind of see how these three tissues look different. Cardiac muscles are used for pumping. They contract, they relax. They contract, they relax. They contract, they relax. And the way that they're oriented, they don't get tired. Your heart never gets tired. Your heart beats from before you were born up until the day you die, maybe even a little bit after that. It will never tire. These other two muscle types can tire. But this cardiac muscle is, it's evolved in a way that it does not tire, it does not fatigue. It's pretty amazing for a muscle that it can't, that it will just keep going, it'll keep going. So let's take some notes here while we just get introduced to these different types of tissues. So muscle tissue, this is the last one. The function of muscle tissue is to contract and produce movement, some type of movement. Three types of muscle tissue: smooth, cardiac, and then skeletal muscle. Now, skeletal muscle is underlined because we're just going to focus on skeletal muscle for right now. We're not going to worry about smooth muscle or cardiac muscle until we get to the circulatory system and the heart. Then we'll learn a little bit more about them, and also the digestive system too. I want you to focus, when you're thinking about muscle tissue, just think about skeletal muscle tissue for now. And this is what skeletal muscle tissue looks like under the microscope. This right here that I'm pointing to, actually let me use the annotation, maybe it'll work better. This thing right here is one single cell. And these cells can be really long. Think about a muscle like your bicep. So the cells actually start here and they go all the way there. They can be really long and they're flat and they're stacked up on top of each other and then all around each other. So they create these cords of muscle cells. They have multiple nuclei in them. So these are all multiple nucleuses, which the plural is actually not nucleus, it's nuclei. And so when you're looking under a microscope at a muscle cell, you'll notice a skeletal muscle cell, you'll notice the separations in the cells themselves. You'll notice a bunch of nuclei. And then you'll also notice these lines, these striations. These lines, these striations, we call them, are what are doing all the work when our muscles flex. They're contracting and then they relax. It's actually a very interesting process that we're going to be learning about when we look into the muscles, the muscular system, to understand how they do their job. But the skeletal muscle fibers are cells, and they are striped with multiple nuclei. So you can see the multiple nuclei, multiple nuclei, multiple nuclei, multiple nuclei, multiple nuclei. And that's weird for a cell. Most of the time, a cell has a single nucleus. The exception to that rule is the muscle cell. And when we're talking about skeletal muscle, its location is in the muscles that attach to the bone. And they attach to the bone with the help of a tendon. Okay, after you get to that part of the slide, I want you to draw a horizontal line, and I want you to put a summary. So you should have a horizontal line after that note, and you should put on the left-hand side, summary 1. And you need to write for homework your questions and the summary, summarizing all 4 tissue types. So right after muscle tissue on the left-hand side, after you've drawn that horizontal line, of course, it should look better than mine. I did mine with a mouse that has a trackball on it, so you're not going to get a straight line there. You're going to have 3 sentences summarizing the notes that came before it. Okay, any questions about the summary? Any questions about the questions? Any questions about the notes before we move on? See you later, Mr. Eric. Have a good day. No, it's about tissue.